Sometimes the greatest betrayal doesn't arrive with a lie. It arrives with a smile you once trusted more than your own heartbeat. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below, and if you believe loyalty still matters, hit like and subscribe. Now, back to Ethan Brooks. The arrivals board flickered above the crowded terminal as another international flight changed from landing to baggage claim. Around him, families clutched balloons, children waved handmade signs, and reunited couples dissolved into joyful embraces beneath the bright airport lights. The air carried the familiar blend of rolling suitcases, distant announcements, and quiet anticipation. It should have been an ordinary evening. For Ethan Brooks, it was supposed to become one of the happiest memories of his marriage. Hidden behind a wide concrete column near the exit, he adjusted the bouquet of white lilies in his hands. Olivia had always said they were her favorite flowers because they reminded her of fresh beginnings. He smiled to himself, imagining the surprise on her face when she spotted him. She believed he was tied up with meetings across town. She had no idea he had rearranged his entire day just to be the first person waiting for her. 3 years earlier, they had stood in another airport, exhausted from their honeymoon, laughing because neither of them could find their luggage. Olivia had leaned against his shoulder and whispered, "As long as we walk out together, I don't care where the bags go." Ethan had never forgotten those words. Neither had he forgotten the promises they exchanged before family and friends. The promises that seemed unbreakable when life was still simple. An announcement echoed through the terminal. Flight 827 from Seattle had officially arrived. His heartbeat quickened. Passengers began pouring through the automatic glass doors, each face briefly catching the warm overhead light before disappearing into the waiting crowd. Business travelers hurried toward taxis. Families embraced. Friends laughed loudly enough to overpower the airport announcements. Then Ethan saw her. Olivia stepped through the doorway wearing an elegant, cream-colored coat over a tailored travel outfit, her dark curls falling perfectly over one shoulder despite the long flight. She looked exactly like the woman he had fallen in love with, confident, graceful, effortlessly beautiful. He tightened his grip on the bouquet. This was the moment. He started to step forward. Then he froze. A tall man emerged beside Olivia, pulling a carry-on suitcase with one hand. Without hesitation, Olivia turned toward him. Her expression softened into a smile Ethan had not seen in months. A smile so natural, so unguarded, it seemed untouched by effort. The man reached for her hand. She let him. Not only that, she intertwined her fingers with his as though the gesture belonged there. They exchanged a quiet laugh. The world around Ethan continued moving, but every sound seemed to disappear beneath an invisible weight pressing against his chest. He remained hidden behind the column. Neither of them noticed him. The stranger leaned closer and whispered something that made Olivia laugh again. She lightly touched his arm before resting her head against his shoulder for the briefest moment. No anger rushed through Ethan. Only silence. A silence deeper than shouting. He searched desperately for another explanation. A misunderstanding. A coincidence. Anything that would allow reality to return to the life he believed he understood only moments earlier. Instead, he watched the man gently brush a loose strand of hair away from Olivia's face. It was an intimate gesture, one that required no explanation. Ethan lowered the bouquet until the flowers nearly touched the polished airport floor. Around him, strangers celebrated joyful reunions while his own quietly came apart without a single dramatic word. For several long seconds, he simply watched. Not because he wanted to, because his heart refused to accept what his eyes already knew. Olivia finally reached into her purse, checked her phone, and frowned briefly before sliding it back inside. She never called him. She never sent a message to say she had landed safely. Instead, she walked beside the other man toward the parking garage, their steps perfectly in rhythm. Ethan did not follow. He did not call her name. He did not create a scene. He stood completely still until the automatic doors closed behind them, reflecting only his own motionless figure in the glass. The bouquet slipped quietly from his hand, and in that silent reflection, something inside Ethan changed forever. The most dangerous lies are never spoken in anger. They are whispered with a calm voice and a familiar smile. The drive home was strangely peaceful. Rain began to fall against Ethan Brooks' windshield, soft at first, then steady enough to blur the glowing city lights into long ribbons of gold. He drove without turning on the radio. Every traffic light, every passing car, every familiar street felt distant, as though he were watching someone else's life unfold through a pane of glass. His phone remained silent. No message, no apology, no explanation. Exactly 43 minutes after leaving the airport, the front door opened. Olivia walked inside, pulling her suitcase behind her. "There you are," she said naturally, slipping off her coat. "I texted you when we landed." Ethan looked at her for only a second. "No, you didn't." She paused, only for a heartbeat. Then the smile returned. "Oh," she laughed softly while reaching for her phone. It must not have gone through. Airport Wi-Fi is always terrible. She held up the screen for barely an instant before locking it again. Too quickly. Much too quickly. "I'm exhausted," she continued. The conference was nonstop. Ethan nodded once. "How was the flight?" "It was delayed." "It looked on time." Her smile hesitated. "Only a little." She walked into the kitchen as if nothing had happened, filling a glass with water while talking about business meetings, difficult clients, and delayed presentations. The performance was flawless. Months earlier, Ethan would have believed every word. Tonight, every sentence sounded rehearsed. He noticed details he would once have ignored. She never looked directly into his eyes for more than a second. She answered questions before he had fully asked them. Her stories were polished, almost too polished, as if every memory had been carefully edited before reaching him. Then came the sentence that quietly shattered whatever hope remained. "I traveled alone this time," Olivia said casually while unpacking her purse. Ethan felt something inside him become perfectly still. He remembered the airport, the man's hand, their laughter, her fingers intertwined with his. He simply asked, "Alone?" She didn't hesitate. Of course. Not a flicker of guilt crossed her face. Only confidence. Only certainty that he would believe her. For several long seconds, Ethan said nothing. He simply watched the woman he had shared breakfast with hundreds of times tell a lie so effortlessly it sounded like truth. Later that night, Olivia fell asleep almost immediately. Her breathing became slow and even. Ethan remained awake. Moonlight spilled across the bedroom floor while memories he had ignored for months quietly returned. The unexpected overtime. Weekend conferences that never appeared on company calendars. Phone calls answered on the balcony. Messages quickly hidden whenever he entered the room. Perfume he didn't recognize. Business dinners that somehow lasted until midnight. None of those moments had seemed important on their own. Together, they formed a picture he could no longer refuse to see. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Ethan quietly left the bedroom. He carried neither anger nor panic. Only questions. He sat alone in his home office, opened his laptop, and stared at an old photograph pinned beside the monitor. It showed him and Olivia on the day she became chief executive officer. Everyone had congratulated her. Few people remembered who had spent 3 years helping rebuild the struggling company before she accepted the position. Ethan had never wanted recognition. Watching her succeed had been enough. He smiled faintly at the memory. Then he opened the company's travel records. Nothing unusual. Conference itinerary. Hotel reservation. Return flight. Everything appeared perfectly legitimate. Almost too legitimate. He leaned back. Someone who planned this carefully would never leave obvious evidence. Professional lies always wore professional clothing. Instead of searching for proof of an affair, Ethan began asking a different question. Who benefited? That question led him somewhere unexpected. The conference had been organized by a consulting firm. One name appeared repeatedly throughout the financial reports. Marcus Hale. Ethan had never met him. Yet Marcus's company had received increasingly valuable contracts over the past 6 months. Contracts personally approved by Olivia. Coincidence? Perhaps. Or perhaps not. Ethan closed the laptop without drawing conclusions. He refused to accuse without evidence. He refused to become the kind of man driven by suspicion alone. But one decision had already been made. Tomorrow, he would stop accepting appearances as reality. Because somewhere between the airport and this quiet house, the marriage he believed he was protecting had become something else entirely. And for the first time in his life, Ethan wasn't preparing to forgive. He was preparing to discover the truth. You never truly understand the value of someone's sacrifice until you discover how easily the world erased their name. The following morning arrived with an almost unsettling sense of normalcy. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Brooks residence, casting long golden reflections across polished hardwood floors. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee drifted through the kitchen, just as it had every weekday for years. Olivia entered wearing an elegant navy business suit, scrolling through emails before she had even taken her first sip. "Big board meeting today," she said without looking up. "I probably won't be home until late." Ethan simply nodded as he buttered a slice of toast. "I figured." She glanced at him briefly. "You seem quiet." "I didn't sleep much." "You should take better care of yourself." The irony settled silently between them. She kissed his cheek with practiced affection, grabbed her handbag, and disappeared through the front door. The house became completely still. Ethan remained standing in the kitchen long after the sound of her car had faded into the distance. Then he walked upstairs. At the end of the hallway stood a room few people ever entered. His study. The shelves were lined with framed photographs, legal binders, and dusty awards from years earlier. Most of them belonged to projects no one remembered anymore. He opened the bottom drawer of an old oak cabinet. Inside rested dozens of worn notebooks, business journals, meeting notes, financial projections, handwritten strategies dating back nearly a decade. Ethan slowly opened the first notebook. Every page told a story no newspaper had ever published. Long before Olivia became the celebrated CEO everyone admired, Brooks Holdings had been fighting for survival. Revenue had collapsed. Investors were walking away. Banks had refused another extension. Employees quietly feared every Friday might become their last payday. Back then, Ethan had already built a successful consulting career. Several larger firms had offered him executive positions with salaries most people only dreamed about. He declined every one of them. Instead, he spent 18 months rebuilding Olivia's father's struggling company without taking a salary. He negotiated impossible contracts, reduced debt, restructured operations, convinced nervous investors to stay. Many nights, he never returned home until sunrise. Sometimes he slept on the office couch because there simply weren't enough hours left in the day. When payroll came due and the company lacked cash, Ethan quietly liquidated a significant portion of his own investment portfolio. No one ever knew. Employees received their salaries on time. Families kept their homes. Children continued attending school. To them, the company had simply survived another difficult month. They never knew whose sacrifice had made it possible. Months later, when Brooks Holdings finally recovered, Olivia's father gathered the executive team. Everyone expected Ethan to become the next chief executive officer. Instead, Ethan stood up and smiled. "I think Olivia should lead." The room had fallen silent. Even Olivia herself looked stunned. "You built this turnaround," her father had argued. Ethan shook his head. "No." He looked toward Olivia. "She deserves the opportunity to build its future." That single decision changed everything. The board unanimously appointed Olivia CEO. Newspapers celebrated her as a brilliant young executive who had rescued the family business. Television. Interviews followed. Industry awards filled magazine covers. Her speeches inspired thousands. Photographers captured every achievement. Almost no one mentioned Ethan. He preferred it that way. Whenever journalists asked about his role, he politely redirected every question back to Olivia. Whenever she accepted another award, he applauded from the audience instead of standing beside her on stage. He believed love meant helping someone shine brighter than yourself. Looking back now, Ethan wondered whether that had been love or blindness. His eyes drifted toward another photograph resting against the bookshelf. It showed Olivia smiling proudly while holding her first CEO of the Year trophy. Standing just outside the camera frame was Ethan. He remembered taking that photograph himself. At the time, it had felt natural. Today it looked painfully symbolic. He had always remained just beyond the picture. Invisible. Forgotten. His phone vibrated. A calendar reminder appeared. Board anniversary dinner, 7 years. Ethan stared at the notification for several seconds. 7 years. 7 years of quietly standing behind the woman he loved. 7 years of believing success shared with success multiplied. He closed the notebook and returned it carefully to the drawer. For the first time, he wasn't revisiting the past because he missed it. He was searching for something else. Patterns, decisions, promises. Somewhere inside those forgotten years, the answer to Olivia's betrayal had already been written. He simply hadn't known he would one day need to read his own story from the beginning. Betrayal rarely begins with another person. It begins the moment loyalty becomes something someone believes they deserve instead of something they choose every day. 3 days passed. Ethan Brooks changed nothing. He still woke before sunrise. He still prepared coffee for two. He still asked Olivia whether she wanted breakfast before leaving for work. To anyone watching from the outside, they looked like a successful couple living a carefully organized life. Only one thing had changed. Ethan had stopped believing appearances. Instead of confronting Olivia, he quietly began observing. Every morning, she left precisely at 8:15. Every evening, her return became less predictable. Some nights, she claimed to be entertaining investors. Other nights, she blamed emergency strategy meetings or unexpected client dinners. The explanations were always polished, always reasonable, almost too reasonable. On Thursday afternoon, Ethan parked across the street from Brooks Holdings, keeping enough distance that no one would recognize his vehicle. Employees streamed out of the building carrying briefcases and laptops. At exactly 6:40 p.m., Olivia emerged from the revolving doors. She wasn't alone. Marcus Hale walked beside her. Tall, confident, expensively dressed. The same man from the airport. There was no laughter this time. Only quiet conversation. They entered a black luxury sedan registered to Hale Strategic Partners before disappearing into downtown traffic. Ethan never followed. Instead, he waited. 20 minutes later, another executive exited the building. Daniel Foster, the company's chief financial officer. Daniel had worked beside Ethan long before Olivia became CEO. He wasn't simply a colleague. He was someone Ethan trusted. As Daniel approached the parking garage, Ethan stepped out. Daniel. The older man stopped immediately. Ethan, I didn't know you were here. I was hoping we could have coffee. Daniel studied his face for several seconds. He seemed to sense this wasn't a casual invitation. They settled into a quiet cafe 2 blocks away, where the evening crowd blended into soft jazz music and the steady rhythm of espresso machines. Neither man touched his coffee. Finally, Ethan spoke. I need you to answer one question honestly. Daniel nodded. Has something changed inside the company? Silence. Daniel lowered his eyes. Ethan, I already know more than you think. The older man's shoulders slowly relaxed. There have been changes. What kind of changes? Daniel took a slow breath. Olivia has been approving consulting contracts at an unusual pace. Hale Strategic. Daniel looked up immediately. You know about Marcus? I know enough. Another long silence settled over the table. Daniel leaned closer. Those contracts have diverted millions into outside consulting projects. Were they necessary? Some were. And the others? Daniel didn't answer. He didn't have to. Ethan quietly folded his hands. Is that all? Daniel hesitated. No. The single word carried far more weight than the conversation itself. There are acquisition documents. Ethan's expression remained unchanged. What acquisition? Daniel reached into his leather briefcase and removed a sealed folder. I shouldn't even be showing you this. He slid it across the table. Inside were draft agreements bearing Brooks Holdings' corporate seal. Ethan turned each page slowly. One signature line remained blank. Olivia Brooks. Another belonged to Marcus Hale. The final pages described a restructuring agreement that would transfer controlling operational authority to a newly formed investment group, Hale Strategic Partners. Ethan continued reading without changing expression. Then one sentence stopped him. Pending unanimous executive approval. He looked up. Does the board know? Daniel shook his head. No. Who does? As far as I know. Daniel swallowed. Only Olivia, Marcus, and now you. Outside the cafe windows, rain began tapping gently against the glass. People hurried along the sidewalks beneath umbrellas, completely unaware that an empire was quietly shifting beneath carefully drafted legal language. Ethan closed the folder. So this wasn't only about an affair. Daniel looked confused. What do you mean? Ethan smiled faintly. For a moment, I thought I had lost only my wife. His eyes returned to the documents. It appears someone believes they can take everything else too. Daniel's voice dropped almost to a whisper. Ethan, there's something even stranger. What? The restructuring only works if one condition is satisfied. What condition? Daniel looked directly into his eyes. The agreement assumes Olivia holds the final controlling authority over Brooks Holdings. Ethan said nothing. Not because the statement surprised him, because it confirmed exactly what he had begun to suspect. Someone had built an elaborate plan, without understanding who truly held the last move on the board. For the first time since the airport, Ethan allowed himself the smallest smile. Not one of revenge, one of certainty. Because while Olivia believed she was writing the company's future, she had overlooked a promise made many years ago. A promise that had never been erased, only forgotten. Real power is rarely announced. It waits patiently until everyone else believes they have already won. The rain had stopped by the time Ethan Brooks pulled into the underground parking garage of an old brick building overlooking the river. There was nothing impressive about the place. No polished marble, no towering glass facade, only weathered stone walls, brass directory signs, and an elevator that moved with the slow confidence of something built to outlast trends. On the top floor waited Richard Lawson. For nearly 40 years, Richard had been Brooks Holdings' corporate attorney. He had represented Olivia's grandfather, then her father, and for the past 7 years, he had quietly represented Ethan. When Ethan entered, the elderly lawyer looked up from a stack of documents and immediately understood that this was not a routine visit. "You've finally come." Ethan offered a faint smile. "I think it's time." Richard closed the file in front of him. I wondered how long it would take. Neither man mentioned Olivia's name. Not yet. Richard unlocked a large fireproof cabinet standing behind his desk. From the bottom drawer, he carefully removed a weathered leather portfolio. Its edges had softened with age. The brass clasp carried scratches from decades of use. "I've kept this exactly where your father-in-law asked me to." He placed it gently on the desk. Ethan recognized it immediately. He hadn't seen the portfolio since Harold Brooks' funeral. Richard opened it. Inside rested a collection of original legal agreements, handwritten letters, and notarized corporate documents. One envelope bore Harold's unmistakable handwriting. For Ethan, the room fell silent. Ethan slowly unfolded the letter. His father-in-law's words seemed to echo across the years. "If you're reading this, then something has happened that forced you to remember a responsibility you never wanted." Ethan continued reading. "You always believed leadership belongs to the loudest voice in the room. I disagree. Leadership belongs to the person willing to sacrifice when no one is watching." His fingers tightened slightly around the paper. "That is why I never transferred final controlling authority to Olivia." Richard quietly watched Ethan's expression. "She possesses ambition. You possess judgment. I trusted ambition to grow the company. I trusted judgment to protect it." The final paragraph was only one sentence. "If the day ever comes when those two qualities no longer walk together, protect my family's legacy." Ethan carefully folded the letter. He understood now, not only why Harold had insisted Ethan remain involved after stepping away from daily management, but why certain corporate documents had always required his signature before becoming fully enforceable. Richard slid another folder across the desk. The voting trust. Inside was the document almost no one inside Brooks Holdings knew still existed. Years earlier, Harold had transferred a special class of controlling voting rights into an irrevocable trust. Operational leadership belonged to Olivia. Public recognition belonged to Olivia. Executive authority appeared to belong to Olivia. But the ultimate protective voting power remained somewhere else. With Ethan, only activated under extraordinary circumstances. Richard spoke carefully. "No one has invoked this trust since Harold signed it." Ethan remained silent. "I never wanted to." "I know." Richard leaned forward. "The acquisition Daniel showed you cannot legally happen without your authorization." Ethan looked toward the city skyline beyond the office windows. Hundreds of buildings stretched across the horizon. Some were older than the people working inside them, because strong foundations rarely attracted attention, until someone tried to tear them down. "There is one more thing," Richard said quietly. He produced another document. The annual independent audit. Ethan examined the first few pages. Several consulting contracts approved by Olivia had already been flagged for unusual financial routing. Large payments. Layered. Subsidiaries. Consulting invoices with remarkably vague descriptions. Richard lowered his voice. "The auditors were preparing to bring this to the board next month. Does Olivia know?" "I don't believe so." Ethan closed the report. For a long moment, neither man spoke. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't relieved. He was mourning, because every page confirmed that the woman he loved hadn't made one terrible decision. She had built an entire future upon deception. Richard finally broke the silence. What would Harold want you to do? Ethan looked once more at the handwritten letter, then carefully returned it to its envelope. He wouldn't want revenge. Richard nodded. No, he'd want the truth. As Ethan stood to leave, Richard called after him. The emergency board meeting has already been scheduled for next Tuesday. Ethan stopped at the doorway. When Olivia walks into that room, Richard finished the thought. She'll believe she's presenting the company's future. A quiet stillness settled over the office. Ethan placed one hand on the old leather portfolio. But before that meeting ends, his voice remained calm. Everyone will finally discover who was protecting Brooks Holdings all along. And for the first time since the airport, the outcome no longer depended on what Olivia planned to do. It depended on what she had forgotten years ago. The loudest people in the room often believe they control the story. They never noticed the quiet man holding the final page. Tuesday morning arrived beneath a sky of polished steel. Inside Brooks Holdings, executives moved through marble corridors with unusual urgency. Assistants carried presentation folders. Investors exchanged confident handshakes. Reporters waited outside the lobby after hearing rumors that the company was preparing to announce its largest strategic partnership in years. On the 32nd floor, the boardroom overlooked the entire city. Floor-to-ceiling windows flooded the room with pale morning light, reflecting across the long walnut conference table where generations of Brooks family decisions had been made. Olivia Brooks stood near the presentation screen, composed as ever. She wore confidence as naturally as her tailored charcoal suit. Marcus Hale sat 2 seats away, quietly reviewing financial projections. Neither of them appeared nervous. Why would they? As far as they knew, every piece of the plan had fallen perfectly into place. Directors gradually filled the room. Daniel Foster entered carrying several confidential binders. Richard Lawson arrived moments later without drawing attention to himself, placing a slim leather portfolio beside his chair. Then, the room became unusually quiet. The conference doors opened once more. Ethan Brooks stepped inside. No announcement preceded him. No security escorted him. He simply walked into the room with calm, measured steps before taking the empty seat at the far end of the table. Several directors exchanged puzzled glances. One whispered softly, "I thought he retired years ago." Another barely remembered seeing him at previous shareholder dinners. To most people present, he was simply Olivia's husband. Olivia herself looked genuinely surprised. "Ethan," her voice carried polite confusion more than concern. "I didn't know you'd be attending." Ethan met her eyes. "I received an invitation." Technically, he hadn't. He didn't need one. Marcus observed him briefly before returning his attention to the presentation. Clearly, he considered Ethan irrelevant. Olivia recovered quickly. "Well, since everyone's here, let's begin." The lights dimmed. The first slide illuminated the screen. Strategic Growth Initiative. Olivia spoke with practiced confidence. She described expanding markets, operational restructuring, international partnerships, projected revenue increases. Every chart appeared flawless. Every financial forecast promised extraordinary returns. Board members nodded approvingly. Marcus occasionally added technical explanations regarding investment efficiency and long-term scalability. Everything sounded impressive, until the final slide appeared. Resolution for executive approval. Olivia smiled. "As many of you know, Brooks Holdings has reached an important turning point." She paused dramatically. "Today's restructuring will position this company for decades of unprecedented growth." She looked toward the directors. "With your approval, we will finalize the strategic partnership immediately." Several board members reached for their voting packets. Then Ethan quietly spoke. "Before anyone votes." The room paused. "May I ask one question?" Olivia smiled politely. "Of course." Ethan looked directly at Marcus. "Who drafted the controlling authority clause?" Marcus answered without hesitation. "Our legal department." "I see." Ethan slowly opened a folder resting before him. "And who verified that Brooks Holdings possessed the legal authority to transfer operational control under these terms?" Marcus frowned slightly. "Our attorneys conducted full due diligence." Richard Lawson calmly adjusted his glasses. "Did they?" Every head turned. Marcus's confidence faltered for the first time. Olivia looked toward Richard. "What does that mean?" Richard rose slowly from his chair. "Madam CEO." His voice remained calm. The agreement before this board cannot legally take effect. Silence. Marcus leaned forward immediately. That's impossible. Richard placed several original documents onto the conference table. The controlling voting trust established by Harold Brooks remains fully enforceable. Olivia blinked. What trust? Richard looked directly at her. The one your father intentionally preserved. Confusion spread across the room. Several directors began examining the documents. One after another, expressions shifted from curiosity to disbelief. Marcus's voice hardened. This wasn't disclosed during negotiations. No, Richard replied evenly. It wasn't. Olivia stared at the signatures. Her father's. Richard's. Ethan's. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she lifted her eyes toward her husband. For the first time since the airport, she wasn't looking at the quiet man who always stood behind her. She was looking at someone she realized she had never truly known. Ethan. Her voice barely escaped above a whisper. You knew. He didn't answer immediately. He simply closed the folder in front of him. Then he spoke with the same calmness that had carried him through every betrayal. I knew exactly when I remembered who your father trusted. To protect this company. The room became perfectly still. No phones vibrated. No papers moved. Even the city beyond the glass seemed to disappear into silence. Because in a single moment, the board no longer saw Ethan Brooks as the forgotten husband sitting quietly at the end of the table. They saw the man whose signature determined the future of Brooks Holdings. And the meeting had only just begun. The greatest victories are not measured by how completely you destroy someone. They are measured by how completely you refuse to become like them. No one spoke. For several long seconds, the boardroom remained suspended in absolute silence. The city shimmered beyond the glass walls, but inside Brooks Holdings, time itself seemed to hesitate. Olivia looked from the voting trust to Ethan, then back to the signatures bearing her father's name. Her confidence had vanished. Marcus Hale, however, recovered first. This changes nothing, he said firmly, forcing calm into his voice. If Mr. Brooks wishes to exercise his authority, then perhaps we simply renegotiate. Several directors exchanged uncertain glances. Marcus continued. Our proposal remains financially sound. Ethan slowly stood. Every movement was deliberate, never hurried, never dramatic. I agree. The room turned toward him. The company deserves growth. Marcus allowed himself the faintest smile. But growth built on deception. Ethan gently closed the folder before him. Always collapses. He nodded once toward Richard Lawson. Without saying a word, the attorney distributed another series of documents across the conference table. Independent audit reports. Internal financial reviews. Compliance findings. Each folder carried the same red label. Confidential. Directors began turning pages. Expressions changed almost immediately. Consulting invoices. Duplicate billing. Payments routed through shell subsidiaries. Executive approvals signed solely by Olivia. No accusations filled the room. Only facts. One director quietly removed his glasses. Another leaned back in disbelief. Daniel Foster finally broke the silence. The audit confirms that over $18 million were authorized without complete board disclosure. Marcus immediately pushed back his chair. Those were legitimate consulting expenses. Richard answered before anyone else could. Then you should have no difficulty explaining them during the independent investigation. The words landed with quiet precision. Investigation. For the first time, Marcus looked genuinely unsettled. Olivia stared at the reports with trembling hands. She looked toward Ethan. I didn't know some of these transactions. Her voice faded. Marcus interrupted quickly. I handled the financial structures. Every eye shifted toward him. Olivia turned slowly. What? Marcus's polished confidence cracked almost imperceptibly. You approved them. You told me they were standard. They were. Richard calmly placed another document on the table. Not according to federal compliance regulations. Silence returned. The alliance that had seemed unbreakable only minutes earlier began quietly collapsing beneath its own weight. No shouting. No accusations. Only truth separating itself from convenience. Olivia finally looked at Ethan again. For years she had expected judgment whenever they disagreed. Instead, she found none. His expression carried neither satisfaction nor hatred. Only disappointment. That hurt far more. The chairwoman of the board folded her hands. Mr. Brooks. Ethan turned. Do you intend to remove Mrs. Brooks as chief executive officer? Every director waited. Olivia closed her eyes. Perhaps she expected humiliation. Perhaps she expected revenge. Perhaps she believed the quiet man she had betrayed would finally repay every wound. Instead, Ethan surprised everyone. No. The room froze. Marcus looked up in confusion. Even Richard appeared momentarily caught off guard. Ethan continued. I am requesting only 3 resolutions. He raised one finger. First, the acquisition agreement is permanently rejected. A second finger. Second, an independent forensic investigation will review every executive contract signed during the past 2 years. A third. Until that investigation concludes, Mrs. Brooks will voluntarily step aside from operational authority. Olivia looked at him with disbelief. You aren't firing me? Ethan met her eyes calmly. If you're innocent. His voice remained gentle. The investigation will prove it. And if I'm not? A long silence settled between them. Then the truth will do what revenge never could. No one moved. No one objected. The chairwoman slowly looked around the table. All those in favor. One by one. Hands rose. Then another. Then another. Until every voting member had agreed. Unanimously. Marcus lowered his head. The deal he had spent months constructing had disappeared without a single angry confrontation. Olivia remained seated, unable to look away from Ethan. She had expected him to expose her. Instead, he had protected the dignity of the company, protected the board, even protected hers. As directors quietly gathered their papers, Ethan walked toward the conference room door. He paused only once. Without turning around, he spoke softly enough that only Olivia could truly hear. I spent years believing love meant carrying someone else's future. A brief silence followed. I finally realized. He rested one hand against the door. Love also means refusing to help someone destroy themselves. Then he walked out. Behind him, the boardroom remained completely silent. Not because power had changed hands, but because every person present had witnessed something far rarer than victory. They had witnessed mercy, and somehow, mercy carried more authority than revenge ever could. Pride rarely disappears all at once. It crumbles one quiet realization at a time, until the person staring back from the mirror becomes impossible to recognize. The headlines arrived before sunrise. Brooks Holdings suspends major acquisition. Independent review announced. CEO temporarily steps aside pending audit. Financial news channels debated numbers. Market analysts discussed corporate governance. Investors speculated about leadership changes. But behind every polished headline lived a far more personal story. For the first time in 7 years, Olivia Brooks did not drive to the executive parking garage. Instead, she sat alone inside the house that suddenly felt unfamiliar. The silence was unbearable. Her office phone no longer rang every few minutes. Her assistant stopped forwarding schedules. The constant stream of congratulatory emails had vanished. She wandered slowly through the living room. Photographs lined the shelves. Award ceremonies, charity galas, magazine covers, corporate celebrations. In nearly every picture, she stood in the center, smiling, confident, admired. Only now did she notice something else. In many of those photographs, Ethan stood somewhere behind everyone else, holding her coat, taking the picture, applauding from the audience, standing just outside the spotlight he had helped create. She picked up one silver-framed photograph from the company's 20th anniversary celebration. She remembered receiving a standing ovation that night. She also remembered barely speaking to Ethan afterward because she had been too busy accepting interviews. Her fingers tightened around the frame. How many moments had she mistaken for success, when they had actually been sacrifices? A soft knock interrupted the silence. Richard Lawson stood at the front door. I thought you might want these. He handed her a simple cardboard archive box. What is it? Your father's personal files. She hesitated before opening the lid. Inside were journals, letters, old board meeting notes. One envelope rested on top. Addressed simply, Olivia. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the yellowed paper. Her father's handwriting immediately filled the page. If you're reading this, then life has probably taught you something success never could. Tears blurred the ink almost immediately. You inherited my determination. I only prayed you would also inherit Ethan's humility. She covered her mouth. Her father continued. The company can survive bad markets. It cannot survive leaders who begin believing the company exists to serve them. Another paragraph. Never mistake applause for character. The people who clap the loudest are rarely the ones who carried you there. Olivia closed her eyes. Memory after memory returned without permission. Ethan sleeping on the office couch during the restructuring. Ethan quietly declining television interviews. Ethan insisting her name appear first on every press release. Ethan selling investments she never knew he owned. Ethan celebrating every victory as though it belonged entirely to her. And she had accepted all of it, without ever asking what it had cost him. A tear landed on the paper. Then another. Hours later, Olivia drove to the old Riverside Park where she and Ethan had shared their first lunch after becoming engaged. The benches remained the same. The maple trees had grown taller. Children still laughed in the distance. Life had continued without waiting for anyone. She found Ethan sitting quietly beside the water, feeding pieces of bread to a small flock of ducks. He heard her footsteps, but he didn't turn around immediately. For several moments, they simply watched the river move. Finally, Olivia spoke. I've been trying to remember when I started becoming someone I wouldn't have respected. Ethan remained silent. I don't think it happened all at once. Her voice cracked. I think it happened one promotion at a time. One award, one interview, one compliment, until I stopped seeing the people beside me. She looked down at the letter still folded in her hands. I betrayed you. A long pause. I betrayed my father. Another pause. And somewhere along the way, she struggled to finish the sentence. I betrayed myself. Ethan finally looked at her. Not with anger. Not with triumph. Only with quiet sadness. Sometimes compassion hurts more than condemnation. Olivia lowered herself onto the bench beside him. Not close enough to touch. Just close enough to share the silence. I don't expect forgiveness. She stared across the river. I only wanted you to know. Her voice almost disappeared. That I finally understand what I destroyed. The wind carried fallen leaves across the water. Neither of them moved. Because some apologies cannot erase the past. They can only prove that the person speaking them is no longer the same. And for the first time since the airport, Ethan believed that part, at least, was true. Time does not erase the truth. It simply gives people enough distance to finally recognize it. 6 months later, autumn settled gently over the city. The maple trees outside Brooks Holdings had traded their green crowns for shades of gold and amber, and every morning the sidewalks disappeared beneath a quiet blanket of fallen leaves. The company had survived, not because of extraordinary profits, not because of aggressive expansion, but because trust, once restored, proved stronger than ambition alone. The independent investigation had reached its conclusion. Marcus Hale faced fraud charges related to financial misconduct that extended far beyond Brooks Holdings. His consulting empire collapsed almost as quickly as it had risen, built on shortcuts that could not withstand the weight of truth. Olivia accepted full responsibility for every executive decision she had signed. She resigned permanently as chief executive officer. No public speeches. No attempts to defend herself. Only a brief written statement. Leadership begins with accountability. I failed both my company and the people who trusted me. Then she disappeared from the business world. Months passed without interviews, without conferences, without headlines. Meanwhile, Ethan declined every request to become the company's permanent CEO. The board insisted. Shareholders encouraged him. Financial magazines called him the obvious choice. Each time, he gave the same answer. The company deserves a leader chosen for its future, not someone's past sacrifices. Instead, he accepted a quieter position as chairman of governance, overseeing ethics, long-term strategy, and corporate accountability. It suited him perfectly. He had never wanted attention, only responsibility. One crisp Saturday morning, Ethan arrived at the old community education center his father-in-law had once helped fund decades earlier. The building had nearly closed after years of neglect. Now it was alive again. Young entrepreneurs filled classrooms. Students attended free financial literacy workshops. Retired executives volunteered as mentors. Above the entrance hung a simple bronze plaque. The Harold Brooks Leadership Foundation. Not dedicated to profit, dedicated to character. Ethan walked through the halls unnoticed, just as he preferred. Inside one classroom, a group of young business owners discussed leadership. One student asked the guest speaker a simple question. What makes someone a great leader? Before anyone could answer, Another voice quietly spoke from the back of the room. The people willing to give away the credit. Everyone turned. Olivia stood near the doorway. She looked different. No designer suit. No expensive jewelry. No executive title. Only simple clothes, tired eyes, and a humility that success had never taught her. She had been volunteering there for weeks, helping organize scholarship applications, filing paperwork, making coffee, doing whatever was needed without asking for recognition. She and Ethan looked at each other across the room. Neither smiled immediately. Some wounds heal. Others simply become quieter. After the class ended, they walked slowly through the garden behind the center. The afternoon sunlight filtered through golden leaves, casting shifting patterns across the stone pathway. I heard you've been here every weekend, Ethan said. Olivia nodded. I wanted to learn how to contribute without needing applause. A gentle breeze carried leaves between them. I'm still learning. Ethan looked toward the children laughing in the distance. So am I. She stopped walking. I don't know what happens to us now. He considered the question for a long moment, then answered with complete honesty. I don't know either. It wasn't rejection. It wasn't reconciliation. It was simply the truth. Some relationships are rebuilt. Others become something entirely different. Neither of them tried to force an ending that life had not yet written. As they stood together beneath the autumn trees, neither spoke again. They didn't need to. The silence no longer carried betrayal. It carried understanding. Across the courtyard, young students entered the foundation bearing notebooks instead of briefcases, dreams instead of titles. Perhaps one day they would build companies of their own. Perhaps they would remember that success without integrity eventually empties itself. Or perhaps they would simply remember the inscription carved beneath Harold Brooks' bronze portrait in the entrance hall. It contained only one sentence. Character is the only legacy that survives success. Ethan paused before leaving and glanced back one final time. Olivia was helping an elderly volunteer carry a heavy box inside the building. No cameras watched. No audience applauded. No one even knew who she had once been. For the first time in many years, that no longer mattered, because dignity had quietly returned where pride once lived. And on that quiet autumn afternoon, the world remembered what true strength had always looked like.